thinking. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. I'm Chris Gill here with my co-host Abdul Kazi, and tonight, as part of Come Cloud with us, we're bringing to you the one, the only Chris Ayers. So, Chris, please introduce yourself and welcome.
Hi, my name's Chris Ayers. I work at Microsoft, but I've been a public speaker for probably 6, 7, 8 years now. It's just always been a passion of mine to learn things and then to share that with others. So happy to be here, and I know we've been nerding out the past couple minutes, before we went live, comparing Legos and talking tech. So.
See, I swear, we always say that we should record the pre-session, like behind the scenes, like the before we do the actual Come Cloud with Us sessions. But no, we're happy to have you here. So thanks for joining.
Yeah.
Joel, how are you doing today? How's things going in Toronto?
Good. Honestly, the weather's amazing. It doesn't feel like March. To be honest, I don't want to jinx it. That knock on wood, but yeah, it's a mild winter, so we'll take it.
Awesome.
And down here in Tampa, Florida, it's fall spring, maybe. I don't know. I'm in shorts. It's like every other spring, March or February or January or December, in Florida.
So I guess you're getting ready for March break then.
I mean, might go in the pool tomorrow. I don't know. I'll just rub it in a little. I'm sorry.
That's okay. I mean, the other thing, I don't know that we should be talking about it on air, but the other trip, I'm still looking at flights to see if I can make it down there for the event that's coming up here. So
yeah, Tampa Bay Beer Week. Yeah, big fan.
If you can do it, right? Yep. So, I know all these people joined here, our chitter chatter and stuff, but why are we bringing you here? Why are we having this session? So honestly, let's just kick it off. Let's start talking about Bicep and what we can really do with this tool.
Yeah, I am a huge fan of Bicep. For years, we did stuff with ARM, and there were people that loved ARM, and there were people that saw ARM for the pain that it was, which is one reason we have Bicep, and one reason Terraform had such huge adoption, I think, for many people. But and let's just dive into it. So, like I said, I work at Microsoft. I'm a senior customer engineer there. I'm part of the Fast Track for Azure team, and so we're a team that actually helps customers. It's a free service for our Azure customers to help them deploy more quickly to Azure. We help scale our customers' efforts as they go to production, and we give them best practice guidance on reliability, security, and scalability. I talk a lot around DevOps and around automation and around just good cloud architectures. But you can follow me on Twitter, Mastodon. You can find me on LinkedIn. I blog a lot, and out on GitHub, this repo is there. My slides are there. I'm always on GitHub all the time. So when we talk about Bicep, we're going to start with what is infrastructure as code in general. We'll dive into what is Bicep and a little bit about the Azure Resource Manager. And then I've got 20 something demos. Like we're just going to spend a lot of time in VS Code and on the internet. So we're not going to be in slide hell. So infrastructure as code. A good, easy definition is it's the managing and provisioning of infrastructure through code instead of manual processes. I know in the past we did things like, hey, here's a checklist, click this button, then that button, then type in the name. You can get stuff stood up, but it's not repetitive. You can't repeat that process very easily without a lot of human error. It can take time, and you can never be sure things are done the exact same way. Now, when we talk about infrastructure as code, there's a couple of styles. One is imperative. And this, for some of us who have done a lot of Bash shell scripting or PowerShell, this is a lot of commands in a big file. And then you have to tell it what to do. And you also have to kind of remember the state of the system in your head. Or you have to code those checks into your script. Does this thing exist? If it doesn't exist, go create the thing. Hey, I had to create the thing. Let me sleep for 2 minutes while I wait for it to spin up. Have you ever done that? Like it's a pain because you're the one orchestrating all the things. You're the one trying to figure out what the current state is and the changes needed to make it what you want it to be. Declarative, which is where we come into things like Terraform, ARM, and Bicep, are where we just say, I want the system to look like this. And in our case, Azure knows what the current state is, knows what you're trying to do, and it figures out all the changes and steps needed to make it happen. It'll handle a lot of dependencies. It'll handle a lot of the timings and the pollings. We're going to talk about all that. And a little graphic to kind of illustrate that is, we've got all the branching and the tests and the checking, or we just say, hey, I want to make a VM with a storage account and a VNet, and you figure out all the things to do. Now, there's a lot of technologies out there for infrastructure as code. All of the major clouds have their own languages and definitions. So Azure, we have ARM and Bicep. AWS has CloudFormation. I had to go look up Google's, the Cloud Deployment Manager. Like I don't know CloudFormation. I don't know Google. But then we have some ones that are third party, supported by external companies. So Terraform is done by a company called HashiCorp. There's Pulumi. And sometimes people lump in like some of these other ones, Vagrant, Chef, Puppet, Ansible. These might start falling into like configuration as code, policy as code a little bit, when you're like infrastructure as code, create the VM, and then I want to install things on top of it and configure them a certain way. We're not going to talk about any of those really. A lot of times when in Azure, I'm comparing things. I'm comparing ARM, Bicep, and Terraform. Now you can throw for a lot of people in there the AZ CLI, the Azure command line, or the PowerShell, the AZ modules in PowerShell. But I think those lend themselves more to the imperative style a little bit, and I'm gonna stick to like these type of comparisons for right now. And like I said, flying through the slides so we can get to the demos. So ARM templates, the original method we had of doing infrastructure as code in Azure, really, these are JSON files. So they're just big, long JSON files. Now, Bicep itself and Terraform are both DSLs, domain-specific languages. These are languages created specifically for infrastructure as code. Now, HashiCorp's is called, the one for Terraform is not actually called Terraform. It's called HCL, HashiCorp language, and that's used for Terraform. Now, ARM and Bicep only work on Azure. Terraform actually, it does support multi-clouds. What it supports is multiple providers. What Terraform does is it takes HCL and translates things through the provider into REST calls, through their providers. So the Azure provider translates the HashiCorp configuration into REST calls out to the Azure platform. And then the most popular module for doing Azure and Terraform is called the Azure RM module. And that's actually hosted by HashiCorp in their repo, and it's community supported. So it's not written or developed by Microsoft. Occasionally we'll step in, someone will contribute some code that maybe fix an issue. But the reason I'm bringing that up is when a new feature comes out on Azure, we roll out a new capability, a new SKU, a new flag or option on a resource. In ARM and Bicep, that's supported day one, day zero. Like the second it's supported, it's in ARM and Bicep. With Terraform, a lot of times using that RM provider, you have to wait for someone in the community to find that it's not working and then submit a patch. And so it can lag. Like you might not be able to leverage those new features for 3 to 6 months, depending upon what it might be. Now, Microsoft did come out with a new provider for Terraform called AZ API, and it pretty much uses like an ARM or Bicep, like inside the thing. So you pretty much put ARM inside the Terraform and it works. The other thing is we don't manage state files. With ARM and Bicep files, we don't have to keep track of what's the state of the system. Azure has the state management, inside of Azure. So it just knows what the current state is, and you can ask it what if to see what the changes will be, or you can just tell it to do the thing. With Terraform, there's a lot of management of state files that you have to keep track of and manage. So I like to cover this as we dive into Bicep to show kind of what it's going to be like. Now, I mentioned ARM templates are big JSON-y files. I think they're kind of nasty, honestly, but they are JSON files, but they have some programmability on them. Like you can almost put like a little function call inside some of the JSON properties, and it'll do programmatic things. Bicep is much simpler. It's a very clean syntax. It is declarative like ARM, but it supports modularity. Like we can easily make reusable modules, and we can write something out for a VNet, and then we can share that with other members of the team, and they can all use that same VNet module. It has great tooling in VS Code and Visual Studio on the CLI, and we do have some capabilities there to take an existing ARM template and convert it into a Bicep file and back and forth for comparison. Like I said, with tooling, like locally, if I'm using the CLI or something, I can actually just do an AZ deployment create or deployment group create with a Bicep file, and it will in memory turn it into an ARM template and deploy it out to Azure. And the reason we call them ARM templates are that stands for the Azure Resource Manager. Many years ago, we switched from an older deployment model called ASM, back when we had cloud worker roles and web worker roles, to this new resource manager model. And so when we deploy out stuff, say like I have a storage account in my Bicep file, it'll go to the Azure Resource Manager, it'll go to the deployment engine, down to storage, and say, hey, I need a new storage account, and then that'll do the allocation. And I'll touch a little bit more on that in a sec. Like you can't really talk about Bicep without talking about how Azure works or how Azure resources work. So we got to talk about that a little bit. But as I said, we can take our existing JSON files and we can decompile them back into we can compile them into Bicep. It's called decompiling, not compiling, because you compile your Bicep into ARM, and so you decompile your ARM back into Bicep. But we can go out to Azure and we can create a resource in the portal, and we can get our template, and then we can decompile that into Bicep. And then we can also just upload our Bicep straight to Azure to deploy stuff. So we're going to talk about all these scenarios. We're going to play with them. Now, like I said, before we dive into Bicep, sometimes we got to understand how Azure works and how resources in Azure works. So in Azure, we have, resource groups at the bottom. All resources that you have, anything you might want, a network, an IP, a VM, a storage account, compute, a cluster, they all live inside of a resource group. You can never just have a resource by itself. It has to live inside of a resource group. And resource groups are stored inside subscriptions. So you can have multiple subscriptions. You can have a subscription per department. You can have a non-prod and a prod subscription. You can have subscriptions. Subscriptions are grouped into management groups. And, as a company level, they'll probably have a root management group that's associated with their tenant. Like I'm in Microsoft.com, Contoso.com, whatever that might be. That'd be where your tenant and your root management group is. And, for you might have, if you have an MSDN account, or if you have a pay-as-you-go account, you might have a tenant associated with your name or your email, and then you'll have one subscription associated with that, and then you might have a couple of resource groups. So we're going to play around with that today.
So Chris, quick question on kind of the resources, right? Like ARM.
Yeah.
I know for the Azure landing zone, there is a Terraform module that you can deploy. What about is there an ARM module or Bicep
There's a
module?
Bicep. There's a Bicep version as well. I can bring that up when after presentation. And there's also a repo out there called Carmel, the Common Azure Resource Module Library, that has Bicep modules for pretty much every resource out there.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah. So like I said, when we talk about resources, you can see like we have that subscription. So that's how we can identify like what subscription am I putting my resource in, what resource group. And then depending upon the type of resource, it's going to have a provider. So there's going to be some sort of provider. Document DB, in this case, is going to be like a Cosmos DB. But subscription, resource group, provider, and then individual resources. And some of them have child resources. So let's break out of this for a minute and let's look at Bicep. Let's look at what we're talking about. Let's dive in. So this is a simple Bicep file that has one resource in it. We're going to create a storage account. So there's a keyword here. You notice it's like I'm using VS Code, and I have installed the Bicep extension. So there's a Bicep extension that will do a lot of validation for you. If you have problems, it'll pop them up at the bottom. It does autocomplete. It does syntax highlighting. It does nice stuff. So if you're working with Bicep files, I would say use VS Code, install the Bicep extension. Really nice tool. So we got resource here. Resource is highlighted or purple because resource is a keyword. We're saying we're going to create a resource. And then the storage account I have here, this is really just an alias. This is a name I'm going to use inside of my file to refer to a storage account. Like I could call this, Chris SA. It really doesn't matter. This is just going to be my storage account. This is my alias for it. After that, we've got this blob thing. We got this Microsoft.storage/storage accounts. So I said we have to deal with resource providers. And this is part of just, you have to try building stuff in Azure. You have to use some Azure resources a little bit to start understanding these. But as soon as you start creating resources, you'll start understanding we have a lot of different providers. So because of the tooling, it's got autocomplete. And I can type stuff like storage. So you can see we have storage accounts, and we can actually dive into blob storage and file services and stuff. But I wanted a storage account. And for each provider and resource type we have an API version. So there's a lot of different API versions. Different API versions might expose different properties. So I'm going to use that. Now, if I am curious about what's out there, I always say check the documentation. Okay, the documentation. Whoops. So I'm just doing silly things right now. Sorry about that. So I want to do ARM. I put ARM. I put the name of the provider. So we have out on the documentation, what's a resource, an ARM and template. We have a reference for all of the different services out on Azure. And I was just looking at a storage account. So you can see this is showing the provider, the individual resource type. I have a Bicep reference, a Terraform reference, an ARM reference, and I can look at the different versions that are available. I can actually go over here and see some of the sub things as well. But this gives you what a sample resource might be, resource, symbolic name, and it shows all of the available properties that are there to be set. And there's documentation on which ones are required, what it is, if there's character limits, if there's character restrictions. A lot of this stuff you learn by using it. So a storage account, for instance, I've been using Azure a while. Storage accounts usually have a domain name like chrisstorage.azurestorage.com. That means that it has to be unique across Azure. Nobody else can have the exact same name as me. So I need to have a unique name that is unique across pretty much the internet. So that's why it's saying this resource name must be unique across Azure. Some things don't have to be unique across Azure, like resource groups. They're unique across a subscription. So I can make a resource group called RG Bicep. You can make a resource group called RG Bicep. Not a problem. So just the more you deal with it, you'll learn these things. Like you can't help but learn cloud architecture when you try to learn Bicep. So we've got name, we've got locations. So locations are the regions we're going to deploy it. I want to deploy it to East US. Maybe it was West US. Maybe it's Central US or Canada. There's a list of available locations. You can see because of the tooling, it doesn't like that I hard coded it. We've got SKUs. That's a feature of the storage account where I'm going to deploy it out, a certain style. I want LRS, which is local redundant, or ZRS. But I've got my infrastructure as code file, and I want to deploy it out somewhere. I, of course, checked this out from another machine. I was trying to make it easy. Can't make it easy. Why make things easy? All right, there we go. So I can deploy this with the command line. So I can say AZ deployment group. So I'm making a deployment. And I'm telling it I want to deploy to the resource group RG Bicep. And I want to use this template file, my Bicep file. And if I look at that resource group that we were just talking about, it's empty. But I'm telling it I want to deploy. And so it's running a deployment right now. Now I can do this through a command line. I can do it through the portal itself. I can do it through a pipeline. We're going to start speeding up in a minute here, but I want to lay the groundwork for what we're doing. So this is spit out like, hey, it created my storage account. And I can come up here and check. Should take it a second. Sometimes it just takes a sec, but it should be there.
And Chris,
Yeah.
might be a stupid question, but let's say if you want to do tagging or policies, you can, that could be part of the Bicep as well.
Yeah. So I didn't specify a tag, but we definitely can. So let's that document, it's right here. Like in the tags, we can make tags, and we can have an array with restrictions on how many we have. So let's speed this up a little bit. Let's take it a little step further, because no one just does a storage account. What do? We maybe want a web app so we want our storage account, and now we want to create a web app. And in Azure, you have an app service or a web app, but it runs on an app service plan. So the app service plan, the server farm is kind of like the IIS server, and the app is kind of like the virtual site inside of it. So I can say, hey, I want an app service plan, and I give it a name. That's an internal name. That doesn't really matter. This is my alias for it. And I need to wire these up. I need to tell it the app service runs on the app service plan. So I can actually reference that app service that gets created by saying, hey, get the ID of the app service plan and pass it to my app service. So I can reference properties. So this will be created. It'll go create the app service plan. When it's done, it'll get the ID of that, and then it'll go create the app service and pass the ID in. So we've got a dependency between these two things that it's wired up for us.
Nice.
So let's, and we can do the same thing we did before. We can do a deployment and create it out there. And it's still giving me warnings. We're going to take care of those in a minute. So out of the box, when you do a creation or deployment, it kind of does a little bit of linting for you and tells you just some basic generics like don't hard code certain values. So while that's running, why don't we figure out how we can get rid of those hard coded stuff? What if we were to just parameterize our locations? So we could make that a variable or a parameter with a default value. So I made a parameter for location, and I'm going to use a string type, and I'm going to say, hey, I want my parameter to default to East US. And I mentioned earlier that the storage account, that's a global thing. Like nobody else can make a storage account named Build with Bicep Ayers. That's unique across Azure. So how can I make a Bicep file that I can reuse? I can use some of these functions. So I can use, you can see this $brace syntax. So I could surround something with $braces, and that tells it like, I want to do string interpolation. I want to replace this value with what I'm doing. And I have little methods, like I mentioned before. I can say, get the current resource group we're deploying in, and get an ID and use that as a seed to a unique string. So I'll have some sort of value with a unique set of characters after it as a parameter. I can override it, but I can pass that in. I can set variables. So if I want to do like, you mentioned tags, but if I want to have like a naming policy or a naming system that I want to follow, where everything's named a certain way. I can use variables to like plug in the values and have a consistent naming. I can even say I only want 2 values for environment, prod or non-prod. It's not free entry. You have to pick one of the 2 choices. And then we can do ifs and conditionals. So we can automatically code in, if it's prod, make it the bigger thing, and if it's non-prod, make it the smaller thing. So we've got lots of options in how we can add dynamicism into our scripts. And notice, instead of that hard-coded location, now I'm passing in my parameter. I'm passing in some of the values that I generated. So now everything is being driven by my parameters at the top, and I can take my Bicep file I've written and use it across multiple environments because it's all dynamic now. And if you don't know the name of your app service because you're dynamically building it, you might need to output that. So with ARM templates, we could do outputs. With Terraform, we can do outputs. We can also do outputs in Bicep. And let's see what this spun up. So this built me an app service plan. And if I look at my app service plan and I go down to apps, it's wired up my app. So this got created while we were talking, and it wired it all up for me. Any questions on that so far? All right. So we parameterized our thing. You keep seeing us using a storage account. We keep doing an app service plan and an app. These things always live together. Like, they always go together. So why don't we turn that into a module? So we can make an app service plan, an app service module that will have all of its dependencies packaged up in an isolated thing. And if I want to do an app service later, I could just use this file and give it the location, the name, and what type of environment I have, prod or non-prod, and it'll build out all the things it needs. It needs an app service plan, and it needs an app service, and it'll build it out and return that. And this is just a Bicep file. I'm just going to use it like a function call, essentially. And so if I want to leverage a module, here's where things get different. Notice before I was doing resource storage account and I had to give it all of the API I was going to use. But for a module, I can just say module and the path to the module and the couple parameters it needs. So if you wanted to make an app service, I could send it to you, Chris. Or Abdul. I could just send it over to you and you could reuse that.
That's fantastic. I liked it. Made my job easy today.
Like super easy. So with ARM templates, we had to do like linked templates. We had there was some stuff we had to do to make composability work very easily because it wasn't easy. This is very easy to make modules. Now there's something I want to point out. So I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna go to this folder. I create my deployment. Something I want to note about how deployments work in Azure. So I'm on the resource group. So this is the resource group level. And on the left there under settings, there's deployments. So notice I've got a deployment named main, right? And it was 6 minutes ago it started the first time. Oh, I did a deployment and I forgot something. I didn't specify a default value for environment type. So it has a default value for location, so it's just taking that, and it has a default value for these, so it's taking that, but it doesn't know what environment type to pick. So it's prompting me. So I have to give it a value, and now it's going to take that parameter and it's going to run. Let's see what happens. Now you can pass the parameters on the command line. You can pass them in a config file. You can have a parameter file, or you can do what I did and do it interactively. But something I was wanting to show is when you look at deployments in Azure, if you don't specify a name, notice it's just saying main, and before it had said, hey, it did it at 7:23. Now it's saying it's doing it at 7:30 in 27 seconds. If you don't specify anything, it's going to keep like using that deployment name based on your bicep file name, and it's just going to overwrite it, and so you won't see the history of your deployments if you're not careful. And so something you can do is you can actually give it a deployment name. Like I had screwed something up because I was trying to do a I checked this out in Windows instead of in Linux, and so I've got some new line issues that are preventing me from running some of my scripts. But you can pass in a deployment name, so you can say minus name and give it a deployment name, and that deployment name will then be used in your resource group deployments, and it'll give you some history so that you can actually see that was that main one we did a little bit ago, and this is the one we're doing right now, which is completely different. So you can actually name your deployments so you can keep track of the history. So if you're doing it a lot and you don't see any history, that's why. And I'll let that run. But you can do some crazy stuff with parameters. Just as an example here, you can add descriptions to them. Again, you can have allow lists, default values. We can control the min length and max length of strings or values if we want ints. Like we only want 1 instance or 10 instances, so we don't want to like go crazy. We can provide objects. So if you want to provide an object, you can pass an object in as a parameter, and you can see we want to have consistent naming across our application. So we can take those parameters and then we can compose up the actual names of all of our resources. And we can enforce that every single deployment.
Sweet.
All right. So what about passwords? Sometimes we've got to store passwords, right? Like you want to, some resources, you have to create it and give it an admin password, like a VM or an SQL server. Sometimes it asks, what is the SQL password, administrator password? Now, what we can do is we can say @secure. So that'll not be mirrored on the screen, and it won't be output or saved in places. And we can actually do some things like store them in Key Vault. So like down here, I want to have a password, but I don't want to actually store the password in my parameter file. So I have this parameter file. I'm passing in my SKU and my login. Well, I can go out to Key Vault. So I can go out to Azure, and the solution that we have for securely storing values is Key Vault. So I've created a Key Vault. I've got one right here. And I can come down to my keys and I can see I don't have any keys, but I can look at my secrets, and I've saved a secret for a login, and I've saved a secret for a password. So I can see these two things, and my secret identifier, which it's blanked out, but my secret identifier has my Key Vault secrets, and then this is the secret name, and then that's the version. So what I've done is said, hey, for my subscription, there's my Key Vault, provider Key Vault. This is the Key Vault that we're going to be leveraging to pull the password. And then this is the secret name we want to use. And so we can just do the same deployment as before. If we want, we can, pass in the parameters as that parameter file, but we don't have to do anything else. That parameter file will connect when we deploy this file out, the bicep and the parameter file. Azure will get those, and Azure will go, oh, there's a key vault reference. Let me go over to key vault, get the right secret, and pass it to the Bicep file that's deploying out the SQL server and give it the right value. I don't need permission to see it. I'm never going to see the secret. I don't need to see the secret. Azure is going to ask Azure for the password and give it to Azure to deploy it to Azure. If that makes sense. We can do that. And now we can securely deploy things, and I don't have the secret. And the administrator doesn't have to give me the secret. We've just wired it up through Key Vault. And I'll let that run while we chat. So what about conditional deployments? What if you need to do certain things in certain situations? Like, do you always need to, if you're building out your dev environment, do you always need to deploy an audit trail for every single thing? Or is that mainly a production thing for you? Or maybe you need to have a load balancer with a cache in front of it when you're in prod, but you don't in dev. Well, we can do equality tests. So auditing enabled is, hey, is our environment equal to prod? If it's true, then auditing is on. If it's not, it's not. And we can, there's restrictions on storage account names where there are only so many characters. We can build out our whole unique thing and limit our storage account names to 24 characters so that we can fit it in the restrictions of things. And here's where things get awesome. We can just go, I want to deploy an audit storage account if auditing is enabled. That right there is going to conditionally deploy. If it's true, it'll deploy the resource. If it's false, it won't deploy the resource. So we can write our modules in a way that can be reused depending upon conditions. All right. And, we deployed some stuff out here just to take a look real quick. Like we deployed an app service plan, we deployed an SQL server, all those things got deployed and wired up while we were chatting. I'm going to deploy some real stuff in a few minutes, but just want to keep showing some of the capabilities of Bicep because just knowing these things exist gives you some awesome power. Do you need 3 storage accounts in different regions? We can just do a 4 in. So for each storage account in the storage account names list, make storage accounts. So this name is the name we're referencing right there. And we can take this very far. Like we can go, I want to get the index. So just give me a range of 1 to 4, and I'll use that to make storage account 1, 2, 3, 4. Or, hey, let's get some passwords and locations, and let's build out, give me the location and the index, and then let's make SQL 1, 2, 3, and 4. Boom. Like if you've ever tried to do this in ARM, this is a pain. This is a nightmare. It's very easy here. What if you want to do a object array? You want to have an array of things. So we've got, our West Europe server that's prod. We have our East US that's dev, and East Asia that's prod. Can we do conditionals with a loop? Yeah, we can. What if you want? I want the SQL servers if it's a prod one. So you can literally only take the ones that meet certain criteria and do those from a big configuration map, if that's something you had. Like Bicep is super powerful. We can do nested loops. So we can, if we need to make VNets in multiple locations, but we need 2 subnets for each VNet, and we want to make sure that the addressing is proper for each one as we go, we can take our locations, get the index, use that for our address prefixes, and then do a loop based on that to do the rest of our site or networking. Yeah, front end, back end arrays. We can easily leverage those in different ways. So we can build out a big property space, and then we can deploy it down. We can output items as well. It's easy to output multiple items, and then we can actually do various outputs this way if we want to output storage account information. So I just wanted to show how you could do some of those copy loops and how you can do that. If we were going to deploy it, like if we want to actually deploy one of these where we're saying West Central, and I don't think I actually have a parameter file that has the password here. So let me just copy my parameter file from over here. Oh, okay. I must have changed the name of the password. Or not. Oh. Remove unnecessary strained relation.
Oh, Chris, I think what it's prompting for is login password, but I think you have SQL Server Administrator password, or is it?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it wanted. Yeah.
It's like live demo and live troubleshooting, folks. We love it.
I'm not worried about it. We'll come back to it. Let's just do this. Main bicep. That is administrator.
So we just want to make sure everybody's paying attention, right, Chris?
There we go. That's what it was. Boom. Boom. There we go. That should fix it. Well, I didn't have it wired up through Key Vault, and I was like, oh, I don't have my parameter file. Yeah, it doesn't like all my parameters because I'm reusing them from somewhere else. So we'll just move on. We'll come back.
Don't worry.
Yep. So what about doing it with with modules? Can we do the loop syntax with modules? And the answer is yes, we can. Just like we can with anything else, we can actually put all that database logic where we wanted a location and an admin and a password and all of our SKU information. We can take all of this and store it in its own bicep file with outputs, and then we can deploy this in a loop if we so chose with VNets. And I'll just type in a silly password. I'm going to delete the thing, so I don't care. See what it says. If it took that. Here we go. Yep. If we come out here and we take a look, I have stuff start deploying shortly. Now, we've seen the app service as a module. We've seen database as a module. While that deploys, what else can we do as modules? Well, we can, especially as we want to get data out and wire things up. So we've got our app service module that we talked about before, and this time we're still outputting our thing. But what about a CDN? I mentioned that we want to put CDN protection in front of our app. Well, there are certain things that the CDN service in Azure needs, like a host name and a profile name. And you can see I've got some defaults defining these, like the endpoint and HTTPS. And so we've got our resource, we've got our endpoint, and we're passing in various properties we need. Now, notice there's no commas at the end, but yeah, we're passing that stuff in. So in our main, when we deploy out our module, and we give it the app service names, we can wire up things just like we can with resources. Like we want to know the app outputs app service host name. So we're going to say, hey, take my app, put a CDN in front of it, and use the dynamically generated host name. And it's optional. We can optionally deploy this or not. We've got a flag coming in, right now it defaults to yes, but we can optionally deploy it. And we can optionally output. If we're deploying our CDN, use the CDN. If we're not, use our app service. So you've got a fully modular, reusable app with CDN that we can leverage. That's pretty cool. Child resources. So there are times, and I hinted before, like there are times where, you have a storage account and then maybe you have blob storage as a child resource, or you have a Cosmos account and then you have other things underneath it, or you have log analytics and you need to do a diagnostic setting. These are in Azure child resources. So we can create our Cosmos DB, the required properties. We can create under our document DB database accounts an SQL. So an SQL under, let's see here. Yeah, we had some sort of provisioning error on the databases. Let's see if any got made. Might have had a couple made from our loop earlier. Yep. So we got East and West US got built. We got our VNets built. So all that was getting built. So just had a deployment error. But we've got our Cosmos, we got our databases, and we're saying this falls under the Cosmos DB account. So this is one of those child accounts. And then we actually can have nested stuff. So once we get to our resources, we've got a log analytics workspace, and we've got the account diagnostics, and then here we've got a storage account resource with a child blob service resource inside of it. And this is referencing an existing one. So in Terraform, that might be a data. Here we say existing if we want to call out to a service that already exists. And yeah, if you guys have questions, feel free to pop them in. I know that this can be a little challenging if you're not new to cloud and you're learning cloud while you're learning DevOps. That can be a lot of fun. So let me do this. Okay, let me just do that. It's going to make my life easier because I'm about to do. There we go. So I can do what if. So what if deployment is different than the other deployments. So before, when I was doing deployments, I was saying AZ deployment group create. And that's saying, go ahead and create the resources based on my Bicep file. This time, I'm doing a what if. What if, what's going to happen if I go deploy this resource out there? And so this file talks about VNets. It's going to create a VNet. It's going to create it in East. It's going to have an address space. It's going to have some subnets. It's going to have some tags. Now, the other thing it says is I'm ignoring these other resources, those database resources that are out there. And the reason that is when you deploy stuff to Azure, there's actually two modes. They defaults to something called incremental mode. So, and I just want to bring this up because this can be pain if you mess it up. So it defaults to incremental mode, but when you talk about complete mode says, hey, this deployment we're going to do, I want that resource group, that subscription, that management group, whatever it is, to be exactly what I have inside my file. Nothing else should be there. No other settings should exist. No other resource should exist. So if I do this deployment and I were to say complete mode, it would delete my other VNets and my servers and everything. It would just make them go away because I don't have them defined in this Bicep file. If I do an incremental mode, it goes, okay, there's other stuff out there, but it's not directly talking about this VNet. It's not directly talking about this subnet. And so because of that, I can, with incremental mode, it's very easy to work with other people and do stuff. I just want to call out, but if you do the complete mode, it will wipe things out. So most people don't need complete mode, and it will hurt you a lot of times if you do it. I'm just going to delete these intentionally right now because I want to do this and show you what it looks like. But another thing you can do in Azure is you can specify resource locks. So if there's stuff that even accidentally you want to make sure never gets deleted and nothing happens to it, you can put resource locks in place to prevent deletion, to prevent modification. So those are things that you can do. All right. So we got that deployment running. And the reason I want to run this deployment is I want to show you what if. I got a couple more things to show after this, and then we can really have fun. So I deployed the resource group out there, or the VNets, and there's our VNet, and there's our tags that we specified, and our subnets. What happens when we change things? And this is what we're going to do. So what happens if I change this to B and save it? You know, I can do that what if again. And this is where I want to show some cool stuff. Let me actually side by side that. I don't want to side by side that. Oh. All right, so I changed the tag. This is saying it's only going to change really the owner tag that I specified, right? That's all it's really going to do. Okay. What about if instead of changing that, I change a subnet? What happens if I change the subnet? I can see, you know, what's modified and what gets deleted. So sometimes with Terraform, you're going to run into like, oh, it deleted the thing and it recreated it. There are some properties in Azure on some resources that cannot be modified. So if I change something like, you know, this case, it changed the subnet, that was okay. That worked fine. What happens if I change my prefix? You know, now I'm changing this prefix. I have to pretty much change it everywhere because it'll complain if I don't. What's going to happen? It's probably going to have to delete the subnets and recreate them because they have a completely different address space and address prefix. So there are times with what you change will trigger a full deletion and recreation. Notice I'm specifying subnets here in my VNet. You can specify subnets elsewhere if you want. Yeah, see, deleted, recreated, it's deleting, recreating stuff. If you say it's an empty subnet and then you have subnets listed elsewhere, it'll delete and recreate them multiple times. And that can be unexpected behavior if you don't know what you're looking for. You can also have it confirm. You can do a create with a confirm.
So, Chris, if you don't mind, there's something interesting you said about, you know, deleting and recreating, and I immediately thought about like resource locks. So how does that play?
Well, if you have a resource lock and you say you can't delete it, and you try to change a property that will delete certain things, if you have a resource lock on like the VNet, this change would probably go through just fine because you're not deleting the VNet.
All right.
Now, if you had a read-only lock, it wouldn't let this go through because you're changing it. Now, if you like had a resource lock on an individual subnet, then you wouldn't be able to delete it. Like that's how that would kind of work.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. So you saw how easy it was to create modules. Creating modules that much means we want to share the modules. So we had that CDN module. We thought it was awesome. I want to be able to share it with you. I want to be able to share it with other people, and my website module. I want to be able to share these. So I can have a couple of options, and one of the cooler options is that I can kind of show, like I can point out at an ACR. So an ACR in Azure is called an Azure Container Registry. It is a place where you can store container images, and you can actually also store Bicep modules in your container registry. So in my container registry, I can compile and send up and have a hash on my individual modules. And you can have, so this is my Bicep module artifact. You can see the layers for it, the annotations. It is an OCI image. I can, share this reference with you. And then if you were going to use it, you could reference Bicep ACR website and the version or the tag or the whatever you wanted. Now I ran this little script to deploy it out there, and you can see I'm doing a AZ Bicep publish, and I'm saying publish my Bicep file to that repo, and I'm giving it a date. You can give it a hash, you give it a v1 tag, so you can have stable, unique tags. You can do whatever you want, and you can publish out your modules. You can see I'm publishing it a couple times. So we can store our modules, we can reuse them, we can share them that way, which means I need to be able to use them. So how do I reference a module stored in a Bicep ACR? Well, I want to use a Bicep registry : my registry, my module, and my version. So I can just use that just like I did everything else. Instead of doing the file path, I can do that. This is a problem, though, that tickles my DevOps spidey sense. I've hard-coded a URL into my module. I don't like magic strings, much less magic URLs. So how do we not do that? Well, what if I told you we can use a config file to say, hey, whenever I ask for a Bicep registry named Ayers, pointed at that one. And now it's a JSON file, which means I can modify this in my pipelines very easily. I can override it, I can tweak it, so I could have one for dev, one for prod, one for whatever, and I can just say, hey, use this Bicep registry module. That's pretty hot, isn't it?
That is awesome.
Which means it's in an ACR, it can be scanned, it's isolated. You don't have to do things like doing a Git submodule checkout of a shared DevOps repo. You don't have to copy files from this place and then drop them in. Like, you don't have to do all that stuff. Those are annoying things to me. I don't like doing them. And this seems much cleaner. So I got one or a couple more things, and then I'm pretty much ready for all the questions you guys have. So next sample, I want to show, how do we build and deploy things? What's a way we can use Bicep to build and deploy our applications? So I've got a pipeline. There you go. Doesn't seem like it's wanting to trigger right now. Well, I will just show you how it works. So, we're going to do our normal, like, hey, I want to build my .NET app. I want to restore it. I want to do my tests. I'm going to publish my code. And what that looks like when we're looking at like the .GitHub workflows, we're oh, wrong place. What that looks like is we're just setting up .NET. We're going to restore it. I've got a whole nother talk on GitHub Actions if you want to dive into that, but building, testing, publishing, and then I upload the artifact for the web app, and I upload all my Bicep code. So I actually have two artifacts, and I want to deploy out my web app. Now, if we look at this solution, I have my infrastructure as code, my Bicep, next to my application. And I do that because they're coupled. If you add Redis to your app, you got to add Redis to your infrastructure, right? Mm-hmm. Like they're tied together. It's a new dependency, and they should exist together. And the infrastructure as code today matches the app today. So it self-documents. But I'm still doing some of that dynamic stuff, unique strings in this particular case. So I won't know the name of my web app right away when I'm deploying it out. So I need to figure out how to get the name out. So I get my Bicep. I log into Azure from GitHub. And this is the ARM deploy action. So the ARM deploy action deploys Bicep files. You don't need a separate Bicep action in GitHub. You don't need a separate Bicep action in Azure DevOps. The ARM deploy action, you can see I'm just, instead of an ARM template, I'm giving it a Bicep template. Doesn't matter. It works fine. And then I can give it parameters. I can just give it parameters. That works fine too. So this is going to go dynamically create my website. And then when it's done, it's going to do a web app deployment to the name it made. I don't know what it is, but it's going to figure it out. And it's going to put the web app on the thing it made. And everybody's going to be happy. All right. So there we go. Something happens. Let's see if this is now running. That's weird. Seems like GitHub doesn't want to run right now. Or not update.
This is where I always insert the term speed of cloud. But
it'll be fine.
Yeah.
So, so that's just a basic little .NET app that you deploy. Now, sometimes, just like with code, you might want to refactor your Bicep to make it easy to modify. There's, like I've got locations and SKU names and capacity. I've got all sorts of varied parameters mixed in here, a managed identity, a role, a website name. I've got variables around hosting. Like you can refactor stuff by parameter. You can group stuff by var. You can have individual resources. Like I have a storage account, a container, and a server. But then I have some other variables down here. So just like with bad code, where you can sprinkle references to things all over your file, it's hard to know what's going to happen. I now have to read this whole file to know, like, oh, we have commented stuff. We've got, so we can refactor things to be a little cleaner. We can add descriptions. We can group like to like the location is going to be used everywhere. The environment type is going to be used everywhere. We could regroup things into like a suffix name. So we can have a consistent naming pattern. We can have a group of tags that we want to apply multiple to. You were asked about this, Abdul. What about tags? I can have an array of consistent tags that we do for our project. I get my naming together in one spot. I can even make a config map if I want to do that way. So it's very easy to know this is where all the stuff is. So we can refactor things. So this is one slide that kind of talks about that. Like, how do you want to do it? Do you want individual parameters that are kind of all over the place? Do you want objects? Do you want a config map? You have options. And then how you lay out your file, you have options. So you can group them by type, maybe by use case, by the resource you're dealing with. So all the storage stuff is together. So you can do it in different ways. If you want to integrate this into Azure DevOps, like that's maybe that's why I'm having issues. Why am I? My brain is just going blank for a second. I'm like, what is the damn URL to Azure DevOps?
Well, it should be dev.azure.com, but I'm wondering if you're running into the same thing that I did the other day, where it kept taking me into the portal, and I think
it took me into the portal. Yeah.
Portal. Yeah.
So, I implied that ARM files were kind of ugly, but this is an ARM template. And you can see a lot of similar properties. And for a lot of us that work in the portal, if I'm in the portal, if I'm doing things in the portal, like I have my ACR here, I can usually go down here on the bottom left and say export template. And this will generate the ARM template that reflects this current resource. Now, I will say this is very hit or miss. Like there are some resources that you can create and then you try to export the ARM template and it's not good and it won't work well. You can also get an ARM template if you say create and you come up here and you're like, I want a storage account. And then you say create a storage account. You click some boxes, you go places, you put it in things, I need a unique name, standard, year, redundant, review. When you get down here to review, there's a download template for automation link. And so you can take this as an ARM template, you can drop it in a file, and then if you're fancy, if you're fancy smancy, you can run a command. Oh, I got to do the DOS to Unix. But yeah, something is just really weird. I bet my disk is wrong. You can run AZ bicep decompile. And what AZ bicep decompile will do is it will give you a bicep file. So that ugly ARM template we just had just got, this thing just got turned into this thing through a bicep decompile option. Isn't that neat? So just AZ bicep decompile, and you give it a file, a JSON file, and you'll get bicep. All right, two last things, and then I'll be done. We've got some really cool capabilities with GitHub. You can do the same things in Azure DevOps. With GitHub, we do them in individual jobs, and in Azure DevOps, you do them in individual stages, but very much similar concept. But notice I can have a bicep config file here. I can tell it some of the errors I want for linting. Like a lot of times they're worn, you can overwrite it and say, I want these all to be errors. I could also have, if I wanted pester, I could have some PowerShell pester test here that maybe checks it's HTTPS and not HTTP. Like I get a redirect. So I could have a pester test. In my pipelines, let's say I start a PR. When I start a PR in Azure or in GitHub, I can create a dynamic resource group. I could lint my code and I can log into Azure and I can create a resource group just for my PR. And then I can deploy my Azure code out to that resource group so that you can look at it. And then when you're done and someone closes the PR, I can delete my resource group. So let's say I've got branch on a branch and I have made a change. I've made a change on my branch and I'm going to push that up to GitHub. And I want, just like with code, I want someone to review my code and I want to validate code. I'm going to try to, in GitHub, validate the changes that I've just done. I'm going to see if this is actually working again. Let's see how it
So
works.
Chris, just FYI, it's a rare occurrence.
Oh, sorry. Yep.
I think we actually are experiencing an ADO issue right now. So I'm seeing some pipeline errors
Failures.
being reported.
Gotcha. Yep. So I just started a pull request. You can see I've changed my capacity from 1 to 2. And let's see if this triggers. This should be my PAR validation one that should be running, and it's not running. Yeah, this should be triggering stuff. So I don't know what happened.
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. Well, but that would run my lint command, which just does an AZ bicep build, and that uses that config file I was talking about to just lint things, and then it would create a resource group and deploy out to it. And when you close it, it would delete it. So you could clean up automatically when you close your PR. Now I do have another pipeline, and this one does a whole bunch. Like it'll run a pre-flight validation. It'll let you do a what if to see what changes are going to happen. So we have a different stage that does a what if. It does approvals and asks if it deploys out. And then after it deploys out, it'll run pester tests against your website to see, like, did it get configured right? So let me see if I have one of these valid. Yeah, here we go. So like linting. So I can lint and validate my my pipelines and then preview the changes and deploy it out and smoke test it. Yeah, there must be something going on right now with both GitHub and DevOps.
Yeah.
But that is most of what I wanted to talk about today. Did our demos. Do we have more questions or resources? So one of the things I actually contributed to, and I think this is an awesome resource. If you want more, this really scratches the surface. Out on Azure, we have 15 episodes, like hours of content and learn modules about Bicep. So you can go into this in depth and go do more. My repos out on GitHub have all of these samples, and you can go and play with them. I'm really annoyed at why this isn't like running right now. So there's probably something going on with that. Yeah. And yeah, just I can't stress enough like how much content is out on Learn. So if you guys haven't been out to learn.microsoft.com and then clicked on training at the top, like just click browse learning paths. And then over here, you can scroll down to like, I want to look at DevOps. And it's like all this stuff. And you're like, I want to look at DevOps on Azure. And like, yeah, getting started with Azure DevOps, exploring pipelines, pull requests, or you can say, I want to do Bicep. So using automation at code and building templates. You know, if you're out there and you're looking at the documentation on like app service on Azure, you know, and you're here on the app service for Azure, we have quick starts. So like ARM templates and we've got deploy to Azure buttons. We have so many out. Yeah, there's got to be something going on with the things.
Of course.
So out on the Azure quick starts, like we have so many different resources available. You know, I think earlier we were looking at, I have no idea what's going on. I something weird is happening to my side too. Yeah, if you're looking at like the REST and ARM template documentation, there's quick starts. And here they have all of the links to these. So like I want to have a whatever. So it's just it's crazy how much is there that you could spin up very easily.
So Chris, in your opinion, pretty much everybody should be going to Biceps now rather than ARM, or what's your take on that one?
Yeah, I think everyone should definitely consider looking at Bicep. The tooling is better. I mean, if I'm trying to understand stuff and I have these two things side by side, and I'm looking at my parameters for like web app name, and I see this and I see this. This is so much easier to read. If I want to reuse stuff, if you've ever done a linked, ARM template, it's just nothing but pain. And if I want to do something similar in Bicep, and I want to reference modules, like that is so easy. Wiring these things up is so easy, and it's so clean. It just reduces so much cognitive load, and the tooling works great with it. And there's so many good workflows out there and pipelines to automate it.
And then what's your opinion about, I know you kind of briefly touched on Biceps versus Terraform. I know Terraform is obviously, from HashiCorp, and people are mainly using it if they're going multi-cloud. But if they're only going with Azure, do you think there's a value for Terraform, or
I think it adds
stick
a lot of I think it adds some overhead. I mean, look, there's some stuff out here. You can see some samples and comments. We have some how-to guides. We have various tutorials and documentation out here. This is the one I was looking at, like how to store state in Azure storage. But like just having to deal with state can be a problem if you're not like taking the state out of the equation makes Bicep just so much easier. Having official support like the same level as the portal, the same level as ARM templates, like day one support for everything, just makes life so much easier. If you just go out to if you look at the provider, and you like this is the Azure RM provider, and you go out to GitHub where it is. See, there's lots of issues that pop up where these are implemented usually by somebody else, by the community, by a third party, and sometimes that's great, but sometimes it's not, and it lags, and that right there might be a problem enough for you. It's just something to consider.
Yeah, makes sense.
But I if you're only on one cloud, I don't see why, personally.
Which is going to be rare the case now, right? Like a lot of enterprise customers want to be on multiple clouds now, or multi-cloud strategy. So
I mean, they're also sold a bill of goods that usually isn't true. So a lot of people say we have to do Terraform because we have to support multi-cloud. It's right once and it works. That's not how things work. Like what you're using the same language everywhere. That's what you get. You're using HCL everywhere to describe your AWS, your Azure, your Google. But and let me ask you, if you're an AWS guy or a Google or Oracle Cloud or whatever, are there resource groups and providers in AWS and Google Cloud? Do they have the same structure as in Azure? Do they have the same properties as in Azure? Pretty much what you can get is you can have a lowest common denominator of, well, we can use some of the same inputs for naming. And then when we get down into our modules, we're just going to rename them anyways and have the right properties and the right things. You can't take an Azure web app module like we wrote for Bicep and then copy pasta it into AWS and, hey, now we got web app in AWS. You have to completely rewrite it from scratch for AWS. You have to completely rewrite it for Google. So every implementation you do, every resource you do, you have to completely reinvent the wheel when you go from one cloud to the other. And maybe you can use the name a little bit and the tags a little bit, to the IPs a little bit to get some consistency. I mean, am I wrong?
No, absolutely. That makes sense. That makes complete sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So. Any other
Chris,
questions? I mean, it looks like there's a couple of internet issues going on right now, so sorry about that. But I don't see any other real questions popping out at me.
Yeah. No, I think most of the stuff. I mean, we shared your repo on GitHub. There was one thing we talked a little bit about Carmel early on. Is
Oh
that
yeah,
something you
so
just wanted to touch base?
Caramel's awesome. And it's not caramel like delicious sweetness. I mean, this is delicious sweetness, but it's not melted sugar. So it's the common Azure resource modules library. So this is curated working Bicep modules that someone's already done all the work for. So if I like dig down in here, you can see it's kind of grouped like I talked about by these by the providers. So you can see like the compute, and here's insights, and we have key vaults. And so I can like go into the key vault, and there's a README on it. It talks about here are the resource types that are in this module. It lists out the API versions that they're using. This link will take you out to the documentation where Terraform, Azure, ARM. But what they've done is they've taken all of the available properties and they made a module that can expose every available property. So they did the work of mapping like every optional and required thing, and they list out on Carmel, like here's the default value, here are the allowed values. Like they've shown you like, hey, here's the diagnostic table. We're setting it to all, but you could do it audit only. Retention, it defaults to 365. You can change it. And so they have all of the properties. And then at the bottom, they're like, well, how do I use the role assignments? Well, here's how you use role assignments. Oh, how do I use tags? Well, here's how you use tags. Well, what about like the outputs? And it tells you the outputs. What other ones do I maybe use? I probably need to use private endpoints. Cool. How do I deploy it? Well, here's the minimal deployment. Let's do it that way. Here's the minimal deployment where we say, hey, I want to deploy a vault using this file, and I might give it some access policies and a tenant, and that's not the minimum one. This is the minimum one. Yeah. So I just need to set a couple of things: a name, telemetry, and perch. I can set all the things if I want. It shows you options for every single property. And like it's just really cool that they give you these capabilities, and all of these modules. If you're looking at the docs, you see they're passing or failing. Like they see what they've been working on. So like, oh, I need a Redis cache. I can come down here. I can see the deployment example. I want to see a min usage of it. I can pull the module in and go drop it in and use it, and it's ready to go. I got a Redis.
That's awesome.
So this stuff's awesome. Yeah. Yeah, we got some really cool stuff out there. And then if you see, we got pipelines for different things. Like these are validating it and like publishing like they have stuff that are like you can see how they build their own stuff. So it's really cool. And we also have, I think we mentioned it earlier, the Azure landing zone, enterprise scale, and there's a Bicep. There's a Terraform module one, but there's also a Bicep one because why not? So you want to deploy out a hub and spoke Bicep module. You can deploy out a hub and spoke Bicep module, and so sample pipelines for Azure DevOps and GitHub. Hey, I want to do a hold on one sec. Boop, boop, boop. Yeah, so you can look at the modules and like what they do and the docs on them, and I need hub and spoke peered, and here's all the parameters. So you could do it either way. Like you got options. And I didn't really talk about this, but they have a visualizer, and that visualizer is built in here. So if I, when I installed the Bicep extension, I can also click this to visualize and look and see what's being built. You know, that's
That's
the
actually
thing.
great for documentation
Oh,
too. Yeah,
yeah.
that's phenomenal.
That's cool.
Isn't that pretty? That's kind of neat. I think that's
That is
neat.
very neat. Yeah.
That's kind of neat. Yeah. Like I said, the tooling is just so much better. See, look, storage audit, just, and it's so quick.
Phenomenal.
Sorry, I could talk about this stuff all day.
Oh, I know. I was just looking through to see if there are any other last questions. But Chris, this has been fantastic. Thank you. Soup to nuts. I mean, I know we had some issues. You know, the cloud. It's raining apparently in some parts of the Azure hemisphere right now. I don't know why, but that's okay. We made it work. So
Yeah.
fantastic job in the demos. Thanks for sharing to everybody, to us. I feel like I'm drinking from the fire hose on some of it, but I appreciate you and your work on this. So
Yeah.
awesome.
All my slides are actually in the slides folder. They're I checked in the HTML, but they're in Markdown. So if you
Awesome.
need to, yeah.
Awesome.
You can, yeah, I use a package called MARP that I came across.
Huh.
And yeah, it's really cool. It's a really cool set of technologies. I converted most of my slides over to Markdown because you can edit your slides and then you can export them out to PowerPoint or HTML.
Whoa.
That's
All right.
incredible.
I
Actually,
need to
that
get that.
And
You know
so
what
these
I was doing
icons,
after
these icons are fun awesome. It's fun awesome embedded in my slide deck.
that.
Those are fun awesome. Yeah, and so like that. See, I got the fun awesome import, and then I needed the 2-column layout. So like it has a background 1-column layout, but it didn't have a 2-column layout. So I did like a super simple Flexbox like grid, so that when I want to do this, I could just drop some HTML into Markdown and make 2 columns.
Wow.
I spent too long on this.
Or maybe just the right amount of time. Maybe.
Yeah, markdown tables. Fun, awesome icons. Yeah. Yeah, it's a cool
Awesome.
little project. So I recommend playing around with that stuff. But yeah,
So
and
that was Mark. We'll throw it out there. And
yeah, and this is all in my dev container. So there's a dev container for this project that has .NET and the AZ CLI and all the extensions I use. So
all right, I'll throw that out in the chat for everybody too.
I play around with too much tech.
Where I come from, that's never a line. It's just the right amount. So.
All right,
But
that's working.
awesome.
Okay.
It's starting
that yeah, I went a different way and I got it to work. This one should see it. So it has a workflow dispatch. Workflow dispatch is supposed to let you do manual deployments, but it didn't let me do it. But this one is letting me deploy it. That's so weird. I don't know what's going on. Yeah. But thank you so much, man. I appreciate being here. Happy to come back whenever. Yeah.
I would be happy to have you. So thank you as always. And everybody that tuned in, we appreciate you all. Thank you for joining us. Come cloud with us and hit that subscribe button. Tell your friends, come back for our next session or check any of the stuff that we've already recorded. So thanks again, Chris. Everybody have a great day, great evening, great night, and we'll see you next time. Take care.